Hello, and welcome back to the Lost and Found podcast, the space where we figure things out in real time together. So, this is going to be an interesting episode. Back in the first episode, I said that this podcast would be like a little window into my mind. I don't believe in niching down because, humans are ever evolving. And I want this to be a space for conversations about anything and everything that fascinates me. And I figured that if I spoke honestly enough, the right people would find it and can resonate. And sometimes that means talking about solo travel or goals or ambition, heartbreak, productivity, the fun stuff. But the golden thread running through all of that is figuring out your 20s. And honestly, a big part of figuring out your 20s is figuring out sex. Not just what it physically is, but what it means emotionally, socially, politically. Sex isn't just an act, it's a power structure. It's an archive of cultural conditioning. It's a philosophical and academic minefield. It's a mirror of the world, and honestly, sometimes even a blueprint for it. I was really lucky to be exposed to feminist philosophy and critical theory very early on in my university career because I majored in literature and philosophy. And I just kind of assumed that everybody thought like this, everybody talked about stuff like this because we would have tutoring classes or seminars where we have such big debates about topics like this, and it's just mind-blowing, and it grows you so much as a human being and teaches you how to look at both sides and grow your empathy. But as I grew older and I traveled more and had more conversations, I realized how many people had never even been told that you can think critically about sex. People don't even realize that there's this entire body of philosophical work dedicated to desire, power, shame, pleasure, silence, and how all of these things shape the systems we live in and are shaped by the systems we live in. So, I wanted to make this episode because I know there are young people out there, especially women, who live in silence about this stuff, who feel shame for having desires, and who think that they're the only one thinking or feeling a certain way, because that's how I felt. And if no one ever talks about it, you start to think that it's just you. And you don't realize that there are feminist traditions, academic fields, and centuries of thought that have been asking the same questions that you're asking in the dark and thinking that you're the only one asking them. And of course, this was an episode that I was hesitant to make. I know my family listens to this, people who knew me in high school listen to this, but you know what? I've arrived at a point in my life, and I have traveled to thank for this, where I know that if I'm being honest and I'm speaking my truth with a real desire to connect with people, learn and share, then I don't have to be afraid of what I have to say. And the right people will hear this and they will understand my heart and where I'm coming from. And the people who want to judge or misunderstand, honestly, they made up their minds before they even clicked on this episode. So who cares? This episode is as much for you as it is for my younger self. The version of me who was so deeply curious about all of this, but didn't have the language, and who definitely did not grow up in a community where it felt safe or acceptable to talk about desire. Never mind about the politics and power dynamics that shape it. And if you grew up in a community like mine, I already know what your sex education in high school was. Basically, don't have it, right? Abstinence. That's the sex education. Oh, I remember being in high school. I remember this vividly. We were sitting in our sex education class, and we were just being told by our teacher that it's natural for boys to want sex and to masturbate, and that it's a woman's responsibility to say no. And this teacher, bless her heart, she grew up in her own set of circumstances and power dynamics, but I remember her telling us that God made men so that there would always be children on earth, and God made women so that we won't be overrun by a overly big population or something, and basically telling women to always say no. And honestly, just ridiculous shit like that I look back at now, and I just cannot believe that a grown adult human being with the responsibility of teaching and guiding children would say stuff like that. And I'm pretty sure that no matter where you grew up in the world, that's kind of like the predominant theme. And adults think that if they hide certain things from kids, that it's going to preserve their innocence. But we get this sex education from different places, from porn, from other kids, from older kids, from other adults. So staying silent about the stuff that really matters doesn't preserve innocence. It preserves ignorance. A truly inclusionary politics is an uncomfortable one. It's an unsafe politics. So what does that mean? In an ideology, in a radical theory like feminism, you can't just stop at questioning the power structures. You have to question the movement in itself. Feminism has to constantly question itself and reevaluate if it's still on the track that we want it to be, if we still agree with it. Because there's this idea that feminism includes all women who are for the equal rights of women. But in reality, within feminism, there are so many different schools of thought and women constantly debating different topics. And we're going to be talking about that today. But the point is that you cannot get comfortable within any school of thought, within any radical theory. You have to be constantly questioning and revisioning. So we cannot be comfortable in how we see sex or how it's portrayed in society. If we want to be truly revolutionary, truly experience an authentic form of desire, we have to be questioning what is going on within us and within society. And I mean, in school, we didn't even mention female masturbation. That's how taboo it was. In fact, our sex education was so bad that I think up until the age of like 15 or 16, I fully thought that a girl could get pregnant from masturbating. Which, I mean, wow, I have no words. And so we piece together our understanding of sex from these different sources, from whatever we can find, gossip, teen magazines, or our first little fumbling experiences, or what religion says. But no one ever tells you that sex is never just sex. I was only confronted with this idea when I walked into a third-year seminar called 21st Century Sex. And my mind was blown. We talked about how politics affect pleasure. And by politics here, I specifically mean the structures that shape who gets to want, who gets to be wanted, and who gets to walk away. We talked about how our desires are shaped by culture and class and race, power, patriarchy, capitalism, silence, all these things. And it was really the first time I was being confronted with this way of thinking. It was the first time that I realized, wow, there's a language for this. There's room for this kind of thought. Desire is not neutral, and it never was. And I was so fascinated by the subject that I ended up writing my honors thesis on the portrayal of women's bodies in literature and sport, specifically long distance running and how female sexuality is kind of distorted and co-opted in ways that serve an agenda that has most of the times very little to do with the female experience. And what finally made me hit record on this episode, one I've been sitting on for a while now, is that I recently reread a collection of essays that we covered in that third year class. And the book is called The Right to Sex by Amia Srinivasan. She's one of my favorite contemporary philosophers. But what pushed me to actually pick up this book is, again, a string of conversations that I've been having with people here, sometimes other travelers, but especially some young Indian people, specifically about sex and desire within Indian society. And it was very interesting to hear what they had to say about their sex education, or sometimes lack of, and how power dynamics showed up in their relationships and how pleasure was negotiated. And as I was having all these conversations over the past few days, I remembered that this book that really changed the way I thought was actually written by an Indian woman who was educated at Oxford. And she had this beautiful way of drawing together different voices from different generations like, Simone de Beauvoir and Audre Lorde, bell hooks, all the big names, but then really shaping it into a contemporary theory that feels so urgent to us right now, something that is very important. So today, I want to sit with some of the hard questions. And I don't have the answers, but I think that doesn't make the questions less important, right? Because sometimes sitting with the discomfort is the work. So please, if you are squeamish or if you're scandalized by the mere mention of sex, please, I think that this episode might not be for you. But if you're curious, and if you've ever felt alone in your questions, if you've ever wanted new language for what you felt in your body, but you couldn't quite name it, then you're exactly in the right place. And you cannot start talking about sex education without talking about consent. So most sex ed classes in high school at least mention it, hopefully. And usually it's framed as two people who agree to have sex, so they both consent. And it sounds simple enough, right? But in that framing, it's almost always assumed that the man is the one pursuing and the woman is the one who's either saying yes or no. So she's like this gatekeeper of sexuality. And just a quick side note before we go any further here, I do want to say that in this episode, I'll mainly be speaking about heteronormative sexual dynamics, meaning sex and relationships between men and women, where heterosexuality is treated as the norm. And I do this not because I want to exclude anybody, not at all, but because I cannot pretend to speak to queer experiences with the same depth and nuance as someone who's truly lived them for a long time. And I really don't want to speak for anyone. I want to speak kind of from my own lens and trust that others will add their own perspectives as we go along. Okay? So let's get back to this idea of consent. Now, hopefully most of us know what it means, but in practice, it is often vague and misinterpreted or honestly just straight up ignored. And it's common and really tragic and just infuriating how often a woman's no is brushed off as coyness. And often in society, that coyness is read as a type of invitation. Many men are raised to believe that a woman's no is just the starting point, that if they push hard enough, she'll eventually say yes. And they think that that's just how flirting works, that's just how dating and sex works. But that is not the case. And the idea that a woman says no and a man must win her over, why do they believe that? Because largely, in a way, we're just confronted with this idea from all sides. It's baked into everything, into films, books, dating advice. We see it everywhere. We're confronted with it every day. And this yes-no binary is already loaded with so many expectations and roles and pressures. And that's before we even start talking about the social forces that shape that yes or no. In The Right to Sex, Amia Srinivasan makes this brilliant and absolutely haunting argument. And she says the mere existence of consent is proof that unequal power dynamics are at play. Because why do we even need a system where one person gives permission to the other person? In most contexts, it's assumed that men will initiate. They will pursue and escalate the situation. And the woman's role really is just to say yes or no. And she has to then kind of live with the consequences of her decision. But Srinivasan asks us to look even further, to go deeper, to look beyond these narrow parameters that we have of consent. She writes, we must ask what forces lie behind a woman's yes, and what it reveals about sex, that it is something to which consent must be given. Wow. Because consent is never just about the moment itself. It's about everything that leads up to it. What we've been taught, what we've internalized, what we fear will happen if we say no, or what we fear will happen if we say yes. In some communities, girls are taught that saying yes makes them sluts, right? So they say no even when they want to say yes, because this sexual agency that we have is seen as shameful. But in other communities, saying no is seen as leading someone on, playing hard to get, being a tease, quote unquote. So they say yes, even when they don't want to, because saying no feels dangerous or disappointing in some way. And sometimes yes means I didn't feel like I had another option. Sometimes you say yes to someone older, someone in power, someone who can give or take things away from you. And sometimes it's said just to make the discomfort go away. And then there's this layer to consent, and I think this one has stuck with me the most. And the first time I thought about this was during a conversation with a new friend, but someone who's already become very dear to me. And she asked me, if you consented to someone based on who you thought they were, but later realized they were manipulating or fabricating that version of themselves to get your yes, was that really still consent? Wow, I mean, I've never thought of it like that. That question really cracked something open in me. Because sometimes you don't say yes just to the act. You say yes to the connection with the other person, to the intimacy you feel with them, the story they tell you about themselves, the trust you have between you. But what if that version of that person was just a performance? What if you consented to something or someone that wasn't real? And it made me realize that consent, even though we treat it as this clear yes or no binary, almost always lives in that murky space of context. And when you start digging and you realize how many people have said yes, not because they wanted to, but maybe because of pressure or power dynamics or fear or confusion, you realize there's no easy way to answer or handle these in-between instances. But honestly, that cannot mean that we shouldn't be talking about them, that we shouldn't ask the questions. Because if philosophy teaches us anything, it's that we have the responsibility to ask the hard questions, to talk about the things that matter, especially when they don't come with neat answers or solutions, right? So for me, that's kind of the starting point of the conversation about consent. That's something I can talk about for hours, but I have limited time here. So something else I want to talk about is specifically this question of desire. Not just what we want, but why we want it. Because here's the thing, what we find sexy or beautiful or desirable, these things don't just fall from the sky. They're shaped slowly and subtly by everything around us, by media and advertising and history, class, race, power, capitalism. They're shaped by these things. They aren't just fully formed desires that we're born with. They're fed to us, they're taught to us slowly but surely. And it gets to a point where we don't even know that they're not ours because they're so part of our world and part of our upbringing. So, I mean, think about beauty standards, right? They're not fixed. They're kind of completely arbitrary. And most of the time, they're deeply political. So what's considered hot or desirable today might have been completely different centuries ago. And what is considered desirable usually aligns with who's in power at that time. So think about beauty standards in like 17th century England and France, for example. At that time, having a bit of extra weight and yellow teeth was considered beautiful. Why? Because it signaled that you had enough money to buy sugar and eat a bunch of rich food, and you had access to excess. So being pale meant you didn't have to work outside, so clearly you were rich. Having soft hands meant you weren't working with those hands. You were clearly of money, and that was considered beautiful. That was the beauty standards of the day. But that's very different now. Fast forward to today, and we idolize these toned bodies and flat stomachs and shiny hair and lip fillers and dewy skin and all these markers of wealth that show up in a different way. Because what do all these things say? They say, I have time to go to the gym. I can clearly afford facials. I have access to the right food, the right products, the right aesthetics. And within that lies the hierarchy of desire, one shaped by who has wealth, who has power, and that usually very much links to ableism, whiteness, gender dynamics. Can you see how this isn't just a conspiracy? It's how culture is shaped, and we don't even realize it. But this idea of what we desire and why doesn't just stop at looks. It really trickles down into what we want in bed, into how we imagine sex to be. It really trickles down into the kinks we explore and these fantasies we have and these things that we believe are supposed to turn us on. And this is really where things get even more layered and maybe a little bit more uncomfortable. Because a lot of what we think we want, in reality, we've been trained to want that. And yes, we've been trained by movies, by advertising agencies, media, stuff all around us. But one of the most powerful forces shaping desire at this point is the porn industry. And if you don't watch porn, it still shapes the way you desire because it's shaping the desires of the people you have sex with or the people who talk to you about sex or who you interact with. It's such a big part of modern culture that we don't even realize its world-building power. Okay, so let's pause here for a second. Take a breath. This is a lot. Porn is complicated. It both reflects what a culture desires, but it also teaches us what to desire. So in a way, it's not just a mirror, but it's also a script. And right now, mainstream porn, I mean, the kind that most people encounter for the first times, most of the time before they even have their first sexual encounter in real life, most of that mainstream porn is so overwhelmingly aggressive and male-centered and just saturated with harmful stereotypes. Robin Morgan, a famous feminist thinker from the anti-porn movement back in like the mid-1900s, she once said that pornography is the theory and rape is the practice. Wow, that's a brutal quote, but one that asks us to look at how porn normalizes domination and the objectification and violence against women. And Srinivasan, in her book that we've been talking about this whole time, she cites these studies about how regular porn watchers are more likely to become perpetrators of sexual assault. But equally disturbing, women who consume porn regularly are statistically less likely to intervene when they witness another woman being assaulted. That is crazy. But let's take a step back for a moment. This conversation is by no means black or white. There's nuance to everything. And I want to talk about this other strand of feminist thought, the pro-sex feminists, also from the mid-1900s. And they argued that porn can be a medium of sexual freedom, of sexual expression and exploration, because for most of history, women's sexual agencies have really been repressed and contained, and like society has tried to control it in some way. So the pro-sex feminists had this theory that porn is a way for women to really gain agency and expression over their sexual beings. And that is a very interesting argument, specifically if you think about the rise of porn producers creating films that really center female pleasure and they don't just show lust, but they show complexity and mutual desire and love and a kind of a softness that is really lacking in mainstream porn. So it's this counterculture, this kind of a revolution. But the catch is, obviously, this is like indie movies, it's indie porn. It is a lot more difficult to access. It is not free, it's expensive. And so this leaves us with the question, who then has access to this quote unquote better version of desire? Who gets to pay for the ethical alternative? And that comes back to, where does the money flow? Where does the power go? And in a way, where the money is and where the power is, that which is backed by money, that's going to become the norm. That's going to become the set standard for what we should desire. The type of content that we consume, that we start to think is normal. Not only content that supposedly reflects what sex is, but teaches us what sex is and has this like world building power that can really be dangerous or it can be empowering depending on how you approach it, right? And of course, we cannot talk about porn and power dynamics without talking about BDSM. So stuff like bondage and domination and masochism. In simpler terms, that's stuff like power play and resistance and pain. And mainstream porn is really soaked in this. It is everywhere. And it's also everywhere in dating culture. It's not uncommon for women to say, oh, I like it rough. And that they get turned on by being dominated or degraded. And honestly, if that's your desire, that's completely valid. But we have to ask, where does this desire come from? Is it really yours? Or maybe is it a story that you've been sold? And here's where things get messy. I'm sure you've already anticipated this one, but this is where the nuance comes in. Because feminism is about choice, about giving women the freedom to want what they want and act on it. As long as there's consent, right? You can do whatever feels right for you. So feminism is about choice. But then we have to take that one step further and ask ourselves, are we really choosing this if maybe what we want has been fed to us over the course of our lives to a point where we don't even know that it's not ours anymore? So is it then really choice? There's this feminist philosopher, Nancy Bauer, and she suggests that what some women call liberation might actually be a clever disguise for continued submission to the patriarchy. And she argues that our sexual freedom, so our right to sleep with whoever we want, whenever we want, might just be another form of gaslighting by the patriarchy. And it's this trick that's being played on us to convince us that you're completely in control, you are a liberated woman, you can do with your body as you please. But really, who is that benefiting? Men. Or at least that's her argument. I don't know if I fully agree with that, but I think it's worth thinking about. Honestly, when it comes down to it, what is empowerment? And what is just self-degradation wrapped up in this language of choice? What happens when we've been so deeply immersed in porn culture that we start to see ourselves through the lenses of men? When we learn to self-objectify, to perform pleasure instead of to feel pleasure, and to kind of mold our desires according to what we think looks good and what sounds good and what we think we're supposed to enjoy and what they will enjoy. We're not in our bodies anymore. The pleasure isn't embodied. We step out of our bodies and see ourselves as men would see us, and we find that sexy. We find the way they see us, the self-objectification itself, as this turn-on. And honestly, yeah, it's valid, because if you've been taught for such a long time that this is what desire means, that this is what it means to be sexy, then at one point you really are going to feel like that is the truth. If you're taught from a very young age that broccoli is amazing, you love broccoli, at the age of 25, you are genuinely going to love broccoli, probably. But still, where does that desire come from? That probably wouldn't have been yours if you weren't fed that over the course of years and years. And the same counts for what we desire and how we think about sex. And really, there's no clear answer. But the ethics of feminism, like real feminism, nuanced feminism, says that we cannot shame anybody for their desires, and we should not. But that doesn't mean we should stop questioning them either. Sex is natural, yes, and it's personal, but it is also deeply political. We do not get to pretend that sex isn't shaped by race, class, capitalism, patriarchal power dynamics, right? And so I keep coming back to this question, and maybe this really is the question of the episode as a whole. Now that we've been trained by a porn-soaked culture, by a patriarchal world, to find certain things sexy, to find kind of an allure in certain unequal power dynamics, what do we do with that? How do we sit with that tension without moralizing, without shaming or pretending that it's simple and erasable? Because it shows up everywhere. It's not simple. It shows up not just in porn or kinks or fantasies or whatever, but honestly, it shows up in normal dating life. I think it provides a little peek into the reasons why we fall for emotionally unavailable people, and why these kind of like manipulative fuckboy energy people seem so magnetic to us, and why power and cruelty sometimes gets confused with confidence and desire. You see how these power dynamics play out in society's fascination with stuff like 50 Shades of Grey, or with true crime documentaries that obsessively detail the violence done to women. And you see it in the way that male dominance is really romanticized, not just in the bedroom, but in offices or politics or relationships. These power dynamics are everywhere. And we have to talk about this not to kink shame or slut shame or anything like that. We can't prescribe to anybody what they should want or shouldn't want. But really, this is just about creating a space for better questions, a place where we can hold our contradictions with compassion, because all humans are contradictory. We're all complex creatures. So we must sit with the discomfort and say, maybe I don't know, but I want to understand. I want to ask the question, who shaped this? And who benefits from this version of desire? And what would it look like to want differently? What would it look like if I got to a deeper root of desire and figured out what authentically feels good for me, stripped from any and all influences from society or culture or media, porn, and what all of these influences tell me I should be wanting? What would authentic desire look like for me outside of all of that? And I know it kind of sounds impossible to even think, how would we access a knowledge of that type of desire? Because society and culture and media and our personal lives are so intertwined that it's really hard to think of how we can find a authentic desire detached from all of that. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be looking for it. We shouldn't be asking the hard questions. Wow. Okay, that was a lot. Oh, the truth is, I don't have some kind of empowering takeaway for you from this. There's no tidy moral. There's just this series of questions that I'm still sitting with. Because once you start seeing how shaped desire really is by power structures and media and capitalism and trauma and all of these things, you really cannot unsee it. You start to notice it everywhere, and you see it in the type of bodies that we romanticize, and in what dynamics we sexualize, and in the fantasies we're fed before we even know what fantasy is. But outside of all of that, I don't think that that means we have to throw everything out or retreat into shame and police our desires and turn-ons. That's not the point at all. The point really is just to start a conversation, to ask, what if I didn't choose this desire? What if it was handed to me, slowly and repeatedly, until I forgot that it wasn't even mine to begin with? Or what if it is mine, but I want to understand how it got there? And how can I fully embrace that desire with freedom, without shame, but also with critical thought and not with ignorance? Feminism is never going to be something that demands moral purity. It doesn't tell women what they should want or how they should act or who they should sleep with. But it does ask us to look inward as women and as men. As women, to ask, where do these desires come from, where we maybe feel like we want to be dominated? And where does the desire come from for men who feel like they want to have sex with women who are resistant, or they want to dominate women? Again, it's not about kink shaming, it's just about interrogating the origins of those desires and why they are so mainstream at this point. We see it play out in the dynamics of our relationships and dating lives. It's not just sex, it's never just in the bedroom. It's in the bar, in the office, in the waiting room. It's everywhere. And so feminism asks us to get curious, to take responsibility for interrogating our own desires in order to try and understand them, not to shame them. I want to leave you with 3 questions. Firstly, I want to ask you, think about what shaped the way you see sex, and how do you see power, pleasure, beauty? What do you desire? What do you find desirable in other people? Next question is, what does empowerment feel like in your body? And how do you know it's yours? And the final question is, what are the cultural scripts you've internalized? And which ones are you ready to rewrite? And then we have to get to a point where it's like, okay, so maybe our desire does come pre-scripted. Maybe our desire is shaped by everything that has raised us and that we've grown up with. But now what? Now this desire is ours. What do we do with it? How do we think about it in a way where we can figure out which elements might need reshaping or not, so that we can build a world that's freer, fairer, more tender and kinder and less aggressive, a world that is safer for women and all people, but specifically women, because we're the ones who disproportionately face the most amount of violence. And then how can we create an interpersonal world of sexual desire where we get to want freely and differently and choose something that feels more authentic to us? Okay, this episode, wow, really it barely scratched the surface of what's out there. This was just a kind of a crash course or a conversation starter to the whole thing. There's a whole entire body of academic work and philosophy and feminist thought really dedicated to all of these questions that we've been discussing today. So please, if this stirred something in you and you want to go deeper and think more about this, I really urge you to read The Right to Sex by Amia Srinivasan. That is a book that completely changed the way I thought about the world and human relationships. Then read The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir, classic feminist theory, and read Audre Lorde, bell hooks. Oh, there's just so many. It is really exciting to realize that the rabbit hole to this thing is so deep and so illuminating, and that there are all these centuries of scholars who have thought about stuff like this way before we have. Okay, if I can leave you with just one thought, let it be this. Whatever you're wondering about in secret, the struggles you have with your own desires, the questions that feel too weird or too shameful to say out loud, they're normal, they're human, and you are not alone. Even the people who act like they're on some moral high ground, they've had the same questions. They've had the same late night thoughts and unspoken contradictions within them. So no, you're not behind, you're not broken. You're asking the same questions the world's greatest minds have asked. And honestly, never feel shame for your own desire. Thank you for holding this space with me. It really was a lot. If this stirred something in you, please keep the conversation going. Talk about this with your friends, with your partner, journal about it. And if you have an interesting take, leave me a review. I would love to hear what you think about this. A revolution always begins with a conversation. Thank you for being here. Remember, don't be afraid to get a little lost. That's where the magic finds you. Until next time.